been when you were young, it could have been, sometime today, whenever it was, have you ever felt invincible? There was a time when I was 19 years of age and I had just gotten my black belt in karate and I was feeling pretty invincible. Like I knew a few things. I didn't go out and pick fights, but I had a friend who invited me to a martial arts class at another martial arts gym. And so I was like, yeah, sure. And so, quite honestly, I went there not thinking I was going to pick a fight or thinking I was going to beat up anybody. But I felt pretty confident in the skill that I had developed over time. And so here I was. I went into the facility. It was about an hour and a half, 2 hour long practice. We worked on some different techniques and things like that, learned some things, and I was really happy to do that. And then we started sparring. That's essentially just controlled fighting in this situation. And so I went against one person, two people, and that went well. And then this third person came up, and so I was sparring this person, and things seemed to be going pretty well. But what had happened is, in the context of sparring with this guy, he had turned his back like this. And so, as he turned his back, I'm thinking, this is a prime opportunity to attack, right? Whenever anyone has their back turned to you, you got to go after it. And so, I came in, again, thinking I was invincible, I came in, and I was getting ready to punch him, and obviously, not to hurt him, but to get a point, come in and punch him. And what he was doing at that same time was looking back and baiting me, essentially. And then he back kicked me right into the stomach. Now, I don't know if you know this, but if you take your ribs and where they connect together, there's a little bone called the xiphoid process. Just below that is what you call the solar plexus. I don't know if you know this about the solar plexuses, but if you get hit there hard enough, the natural reaction is to puke. Okay? So here I was, thinking I was going to score this point, and here's this guy coming back, baiting me in, and then punching me, or kicking me in the solar plexus. And I bounced back, because it was a pretty hard kick, and I'm thinking, oh wow, that didn't hurt too bad. And all of a sudden, I turn over, and about 5 or 10 seconds later, we had just gotten done with a water break, right? So I had come out, we were fighting. I had just turned, in about 5 or 10 seconds, I just puked all over the floor. Okay, I realized in that moment in time that I was not invincible. Have you ever felt invincible? Have you ever felt like, oh, I can take on the world, and then you have one of those moments where it's like, wow, I am not invincible, I am vulnerable. We're going to be looking at a passage today of a great man of God. Can you guys hear me okay? Through the microphone? Okay, great. We're going to be hearing about a great man of God, David. A man after God's own heart. King David, king of Israel. But we are going to look at how he reacted, how he responded when he thought that he was invincible. Would you pray with me? God, we open up your word today because we want to learn about you. We want to learn about how it is to walk in a way that's pleasing to you. So would you open up your word to us today? Would you speak to us personally, individually, that we would walk away changed, that we would walk away more like you, and that we would be convicted and encouraged by what you have to say to us today. In Jesus' name, amen. Now realize that David has lived a life where God was with him this entire time. Okay? He had just finished with running away from Saul. Right? He had killed the giant, the Philistine giant, Goliath. And then Saul was blessing him and thankful for him. But then all of a sudden Saul got a little crazy. And so David started running for his life. But one day Saul died in battle. And at that time, everything started going well for David. David started taking over Judah, a tribe in Israel. Then he took over all of Israel. And then after that, he was able to move to Jerusalem. Not only move to Jerusalem, bring the Ark of the Covenant with him to Jerusalem. Essentially, the Ark of the Covenant, if you don't know, is the very presence of God on earth. And so he was able to do that. Not only that, but he was also able to defeat the Philistines, this power, this people group that were constantly troubling the Israelites. He was able to defeat them. He was able to defeat the Ammonites. And he had pretty well established his kingdom. He was successful in every endeavor that he pursued because God was with him. But perhaps he got this idea that he was invincible. And that might have led to his downfall. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up to 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11. And this is what it says in verse 1. It says, "In the spring of the year, when the kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem." And we don't know why David stayed behind while his army was out defeating the Ammonites. But we do know that that was not normally what happened. Normally, David goes with his armies. Perhaps he had gotten a little complacent. Perhaps he had thought, you know what, they're going to go out there. We had just defeated the Ammonites. We're going to go out there again, and we're going to defeat them again. This is how it continues on. It says, late one afternoon, after his midday rest, so he had just taken a nap, because it was probably hot in Jerusalem, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. So, this is what's happening. Just so you have an idea, Jerusalem is on a mountain or on a really large hill. Okay, so here's Jerusalem, and where David lived just to the south of that, almost the downslope of Jerusalem. Okay, so he lived over here, and when he went out onto his palace, he could overlook the entire city. That was a small town, but the village, he could overlook all of it. Think of it like if you went to a hotel, let's say in Chicago, right? And you're staying on the 6th, 7th, 10th floor, something like that. You're able to look out. You're able to see what is going on in the city, and it's kind of fun to do that. And so here's David resting. Instead of being in battle, here he is. He's resting, and he had just gotten up, and he sees, overlooking his village, his town, and he sees this beautiful woman. And this is what it says. He sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. She had just completed the purification rites after her menstrual period. Then she returned home. Later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent David a message saying, "I'm pregnant." Wow. Did that happen fast? All of that together. Now realize that this paragraph probably takes a little over a month. Okay? But here is David, perhaps thinking he's invincible. He can send out his troops. And then he gets a little complacent. And then he's overlooking, because he doesn't have anything else to do, because he should be out with his troops. He's overlooking his village, and he sees this beautiful woman. He calls her up. Isn't this interesting? The Bible called David a man after God's own heart. But in a split second, he becomes vulnerable. If you're following along in your outline, here are the first couple blanks to fill out. Number one, invincibility leads to complacency. Invincibility leads to complacency, and complacency leads to vulnerability. Don't you see this in David's life? Here he's thinking, you know what, I can handle it. You know what, Joab, I've been blessed by God. I've been able, everything that I've done so far as it relates to the kingdom, I have been successful at it. I'm going to send Joab out. He's going to defeat our enemies, and I'm just going to lay back here, relax, and do whatever I want to do. He got complacent. But once he got complacent, that led to vulnerability. And then vulnerability led to his destruction. Listen to what it has to say. So he had just gotten Bathsheba pregnant. Now realize, if we look back at the Old Testament, back at the law, here's a couple things. Number one, he had just went against one of the 10 Commandments. You shall not commit adultery. What was the consequence for that? It was a capital punishment for that kingdom. It was capital punishment. He was supposed to die for what he did. It continues on though. It says, then David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. So Joab sent him to David. When Uriah arrived, David asked him how Joab and the army were getting along and how the war was progressing. Then he told Uriah, go on home and relax. David even sent a gift to Uriah after he had left the palace, but Uriah didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. So do you see what just happened? He had just gotten a woman pregnant. So this is what he did. He sent a note out to Joab saying, Joab, send Uriah home. Uriah was the husband of Bathsheba. And he said to Uriah, you know what? You're a great soldier. We're really glad to have you. Here's a gift. Why don't you go home and be with your wife for a while? Thinking maybe he could cover this up. Right? Maybe he could cover up what he had just done and it would be all okay. Uriah would sleep with Bathsheba while he was in town, and then they would go, and then it would all work out. But that's not what happened. Uriah, being a loyal soldier and a loyal servant, slept at David at the palace of the palace guards. I just read a story or watched a story yesterday about some people that were around the world during September 11th and their reactions when September 11th, 2001 occurred. And there was a soldier, an American soldier, who was stationed in France. And during that time, he had actually, during that time of early mid-September, that's when he had time off. And so his family came over from the United States because they weren't going to have Christmas. So what they were planning to do was celebrate Christmas in September instead of December. And so while his dad was over there, while maybe some other family members were over there, September 11th occurred, right? The planes go into the Twin Towers. And at that moment, he realized, even though he was with his family, even though his family members had come all the way from the United States over to France and over to Europe, where he was stationed, he realized that he needed to get back with his unit. He needed to get back with his unit. Why? Because he realized that there was a battle culminating. We realized that this was just a state of just not knowing what was happening with the United States. And he did not want to be away from his unit while they were going through what might happen the next few days, the next few months. And so instead of being with his family had come from the United States to France. Instead of being with his family, he went back with his unit in France. And here's Uriah in the same way, as a faithful soldier, as a good man, as a warrior, saying, how can I go and be with my wife when all my other buddies, when all of my other brothers out there are fighting for Israel's freedom? I can't do that. I will stay with the palace guard until the king releases me to go back to that. That's what Uriah is thinking. And David is thinking, my plan isn't working the way I thought it was. It continues on. Verse 12, well, stay here today, David told him, and tomorrow you may return to the army. So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem that day and the next. Then David invited him to dinner and got him drunk. But even then, he couldn't get Uriah to go. Again, he slept at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. So David was thinking, well, maybe if I just get Uriah drunk, then he won't have the mental capacity to think about being loyal to his brothers out of war. Instead, maybe what he'll do is he'll go back home, sleep with his wife, and then it'll all be okay, and then we'll cover it up. But even Uriah, even though David had gotten Uriah drunk, which David's going to a whole other level of immorality right now. Right? Not only does he sleep with another man's wife, but then also he gets a man drunk so that he can cover it up. And when that doesn't work out, this is what he does. He writes a note. He writes it to Joab, but he has Uriah walk with him. We aren't going to read the rest of the chapter because it might take a little too long. But he gives Uriah that note. And in that note, Uriah doesn't even know this, but he's going to give it to Joab. And this is what David is going to say to Joab, the commander of the army. He's going to say, in that note, it says this. He says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to put Uriah where the fighting is fiercest. And once he's there where the fighting is fiercest, I want you to pull back so that Uriah is killed. And that is exactly what happened. Here was an honorable man, a good man, a man who was faithful to his wife. He didn't even realize he had his death sentence in his hand when he went to Joab. But he went to Joab, he gave it to Joab. Joab did as David had said, and Uriah died. And then this is what happens. Verse 26, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. When the period of mourning was over, David sent for her and brought her to the palace, and she became one of his wives. Then she gave birth to a son, but the Lord was displeased with what David had done. Here was David, a man after God's own heart, who was susceptible to sin. But this is the problem. If we look back at our blanks, he thought he was invincible. And his invincibility led to complacency. And then after that complacency led to vulnerability, where he was susceptible to temptation. And then when that vulnerability ultimately led to destruction. And all through this time, here is David trying to cover it up, trying to solve the issue, trying to make things work out when they were never going to work out. Proverbs 16:18 says it this way: pride comes before destruction. What does pride say? Pride says this. Pride says, it's this attitude of saying, hey, I got this. No, I don't need you, God. No, I don't need you, friend. I don't need you, buddy. I got this. Here's David throughout this entire situation saying, you know what? I got this. Became complacent, became vulnerable. But you know what? I got this. But then there comes a point in time when the fall and when the destruction says, no, I got you. And we see that the Lord was very displeased with what David did. Realize that throughout this time, David thought he was tricking everybody. But guess who saw everything? The Lord saw everything. This is what we learn, one of the things that we learn from chapter 11, and it's this: sin always costs more than we budget for. Sin always costs more than we budget for. Have you ever been in one of those situations? And I have. I haven't been in David's shoes with the situation that he's been dealing with. But haven't we all been in that situation, whatever it is, when we were growing up or even in today's day and age, where we think, oh, you know what, I'll get away with this. But then we realize that sin will always cost more than we budget for. Here was David overlooking his palace thinking, oh, beautiful woman, I'm king of Israel, I can do what I want. But it always costs more than he budgeted for. And this is what we see in chapter 12. If you want to follow with me, chapter 12, verse 1. It says, so the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David this story. You see, no one else saw it, except maybe Bathsheba. She understood maybe what was going on. But no one saw everything that went on. But God saw everything. And so God sent his servant Nathan, his prophet Nathan, who spoke the very words of God to David. And this is what he said. He said, there were two men in a certain town. He gave David a story, and this is how it starts off. There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but a little lamb he had bought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. He ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. One day a guest arrived at the home of the rich man, but instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. Now realize, we're going to continue on with the story, but realize something. As David is hearing this, realize David's role in Israel. Not only is he the president of Israel, but he's also the supreme court of Israel. Okay? Not only does he have the executive power to rule and reign over it, but he also acts as judge. And in this time, I'm sure David is thinking about the story, thinking about what Nathan is saying, and thinking, man, that rich man is a horrible, horrible person. How dare he do what he just did? And this is how David reacts. Verse 5, David was furious because he was judge over Israel. And if that man ever came to his court, or stood before him while David was on his throne, this is how he would have reacted. He said, as surely as the Lord lives, he vowed, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. He must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole, having no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are that man. Not like that. He's probably, you are that man. Because no one speaks to David like that, except if you come from God himself. And here was Nathan saying, you were that man. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and his wives and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord and done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and stolen his wife. From this time on, your family will live by the sword because you have despised me because you have despised me by taking Uriah's wife to be your own. Here's what he's saying. He's saying, you're that man. He's saying, you stole his wife, you murdered him. You are that man. Realize that sin always costs more than we budget for. Now, what we see is that both of the things that David did, sleeping with another man's wife, and then also killing Uriah, that those were both punishable by death. But it says, why didn't David die? Now we see something that happens in verse 10. It says, from this time on your family will live by the sword because you have despised me by taking Uriah's wife to be your own. This is what I think happened. God established a covenant with David. Just a few chapters earlier, God established a covenant with David that the Messiah would come from his line and that he would establish Israel through David and all those sorts of things. And so this is what I think is happening. God is faithful, does not go against his word. Okay? And so he's not going to take David's life because he still has things to do through David. But that being said, this is what God said to David. Instead of you dying, the sword will never leave your house. That means your posterity will live and die by the sword. And then he continues on and he says this. This is what the Lord says. Because of what you have done, I will cause your household to rebel against you. I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes, and he will go to bed with them in public view. You did it secretly, but I will make this happen to you openly in the sight of all of Israel. Do you see what happened? God said, I'm not going to kill you, David, but the sword is never going to leave your house, and there will be innocent people who die in your family because of what you've done. That's the punishment you get. He said this. He said, you have committed adultery. I'm not going to kill you for that. Well, I should, like Israel should, but I'm not going to. But this is what's going to happen. You've done it secretly. There is going to be a person in your family who is going to do sexual immorality with some of your wives. And that actually happened a few years later with Absalom. And so when we see this, we see that there were consequences to what David had done. Why? Because sin always costs more than we budget for. Continues on. It says, then David confessed to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Isn't it funny that if we step back just a little bit in this passage, David said, I was the one who saved you from Saul. I was the one who gave you everything that Saul's family was supposed to have. Isn't it interesting that all the successes that David had was actually from the hand of God? It wasn't from David himself. But what happens when we think we're invincible? We think we're the ones that do it. Right? And that's the temptation that we fall into, and that's the temptation that David fell into. Sin always costs more than we budget for. So here's the main point of this passage. Number one, before we get there, we realize that God forgave David. This is the last passage that I want to go to, and then we'll go to the main point. Nathan replied, yes, but the Lord has forgiven you, and you won't die for your sin. So here's God in the midst of all these consequences, even though sin costs more than we budget for. The reality is that God still forgave him. There were consequences for that. In fact, the child that Bathsheba had died also. So there's a third consequence for all that. But we look at this passage, and this is the main point. Be on guard for your own moral purity. Be on guard for your own moral purity. Be on guard for your own moral integrity, however you want to put it. Because the reality is that we are not invincible. An invincible person walks around thinking nothing can happen to them. They can do whatever they want, and the rules don't apply to them. But this is a sobering reminder that even a man after God's own heart, even the beloved King of Israel, is susceptible to temptation and is susceptible to sin. Invincibility leads to complacency. Complacency leads to vulnerability. Vulnerability leads to destruction. And sin always costs more than we budget for. So this is what we're trying to get from this, and it's always be on guard for your moral purity. Does it mean that God doesn't forgive you? Does it mean that God isn't gracious? Absolutely not. God's grace is greater than our sin. Some of us, in our own life, we've seen what we have done in rebellion against God, hurting other people, but God has forgiven that in Christ Jesus. That's what makes Jesus so beautiful, that whole situation. His death and his resurrection pays the price for sin, and there is no sin that can separate us from God and his love for us in Jesus Christ. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. But the reality is, too, is that it doesn't separate us from the consequences of our sin sometimes. And so when we look at this passage, it says that we need to be on guard for our own moral purity. Think of it this way. When soldiers sleep at night, there's always a few of them standing guard. When you take your son or your daughter, when you take your grandson or your granddaughter to the park, do you just let them go and don't think about it? Not when they're young, right? Because they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable. And so you realize you go and you play with them because you love them and you want to have fun with them and all that sort of stuff. But you also stand guard, don't you? You guard it because there's crazy kids on the playground that might hurt them, all right? They might hurt themselves because they get tangled up in the wires or whatever it is. We also realize that there might be mean people who might get in the playground that might want to take them or whatever. So you're standing guard. So it is with our own moral integrity. We have a responsibility. This is what James 1:27 says. James 1:27, I have just a brief part of that. Refuse to let the world corrupt you. I memorized it in a different verse, but or in a different version. But this is what it says with me growing up when I memorized it. Religion that is pure and faultless is this: that you look after orphans and widows in their despair, and you keep yourself from being corrupted by this world. And don't we realize in this world, in this day and age today, what is the mantra? The mantra is, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody, it's okay. But the reality is, when we look at David, there were consequences for that. Displease the Lord. So this is what we need to do as followers of Jesus Christ. Number one, we need to realize that we are vulnerable. This isn't in your notes, but if you want to take notes, that's fine. We need to realize that we are vulnerable. And so what we need to be doing is we need to be committed to the reality, committed to growing in our faith and protecting ourselves. And if we do that, we can become stronger. In order to prevent destruction, we need to realize that we're vulnerable. We need to be committed to standing guard. Doesn't mean we're paranoid, but we are aware, we are prepared, and that means we can get stronger. We're never going to be indomitable. We're never going to be invincible. We can get stronger. Here's the way it works in my life. A few years back, I was a pastor at another church, and every Thursday morning, there would be 3 or 4 pastors that would all get together, and we'd talk about life. We talk about the good stuff, we talk about the difficult stuff, and we talk about the things that we were susceptible to as it related to temptation areas and different things like that. And what we realized is the more and more we grew together doing that, the stronger we got. Because we were carrying each other. Why? Because we knew, and there was nothing great about what we were doing. I mean, we were just hanging out over at Chandler Mall before it opened up, right, at that little Starbucks. But at that time, what we would do is we would grow together. And we would hold each other up. We would keep each other accountable on different issues. Why? Because we knew we were weak. I have another friend who has had issues with maybe seeing things that are inappropriate on the internet. And so he has We're sort of accountability buddies as it relates to that. And there's a computer program out there called Triple X Church. And they have this thing where you can sign up for it, and you can have an accountability partner. And if you ever go to a website that's inappropriate, it'll automatically send it to, it'll already flag it to your accountability partner. And so here's my buddy who says, Josh, I'm weak in this area. I'm not invincible in this area. I'm weak, I'm vulnerable. So this is what I need to do. I need us to get together, and I need us to build strength so that we can, I need to be committed to this. So will you help me be committed to this? So then what happens? We're stronger together. We're never going to be invincible, but we're stronger. We're aware. We're alert. We're standing guard. We're on guard for our own moral integrity. You see, the downside of this, if we don't do that, we'll experience something like David, where his thought, where he thought he was indestructible, where he thought he was invincible, led to complacency, led to vulnerability, led to destruction. But on the positive side, whether it's hanging out with people on a Thursday morning, or whether it's saying, hey, to a buddy, just help me with this, I'm vulnerable, or praying out to the Lord, help me with this. I know that I'm weak here. So either bring friends around or encourage me to continue on strong in this area, whatever it is. What we can see is when we see those vulnerabilities and we're committed to standing guard, to being on guard for our own moral integrity, we can be stronger together. And that is the positive side to this story. So would you realize that we are not invincible? But at times we are vulnerable because there is an enemy out there that's wanting to take us out. But if we understand that and we're committed to being strong together, we can overcome those things. Not because we're invincible, but because we serve a God who is, and we are committed to following Him. Would you pray with me?